Imagine this, you've lost everything. Your husband is gone, your debts are mounting, and now, your worst nightmare becomes reality. The creditors have come, and they're not just taking your belongings, they're taking your children. This is the story of a woman facing the impossible, a woman with nothing left, except her faith. Her name was never recorded in history, but her story would be passed down for generations, as an extraordinary testament of God's miraculous provision. Today, we dive into one of the most powerful stories of faith, desperation, and divine provision, the widow's oil. To understand the weight of this story, let's step into the life of this widow. She was the wife of a prophet, a man who had dedicated his life to serving God. Yet, despite his devotion, he left behind no wealth for his family, only mounting debts. In those days, there were no social safety nets, no family wealth to fall back on, and certainly no easy way out of debt. As she paces around her small, dimly lit home, her heart races. She's racked with worry, not for herself, but for her two young sons. She knows the law of the land. According to Israelite tradition, unpaid debts could mean servitude. Her boys could be taken as bondservants until the debt was paid. In her desperation, the widow's mind races with one question: what can I do? Have you ever felt that level of desperation? That feeling that no matter what you do, there's no solution. For this widow, there was only one place left to turn. With trembling hands and a heart full of desperation, she seeks out the prophet Elisha. She knows that Elisha is a man of God, and if anyone could help her, it would be him. When she finally reaches him, her voice trembles as she shares her story. The widow said, "My husband was your servant, a faithful man of God, but he left us with debt. Now, the creditors are coming to take my sons as slaves." Elisha, moved by compassion and stirred by her faith, doesn't dismiss her. Instead, he asks a peculiar question. Elisha asked her, "What do you have in your house?" She pauses, thinking about her meager belongings. "Nothing," she says, almost in a whisper. But then, as if remembering an old, nearly forgotten item, she adds. Widow replied, "I have a small jar of oil." To most people, a small jar of oil wouldn't mean much. It was probably just enough to cook a simple meal, hardly enough to change her situation. Yet, in God's eyes, even the smallest things can be transformed into miracles. "Go," Elisha tells her, "and borrow empty jars from your neighbors. Don't just gather a few, get as many as you can. Then go into your house, close the door behind you and your sons, and start pouring oil into all the jars." Imagine the courage it must have taken. She had to trust that the little oil she had would somehow fill an entire house full of jars. But despite her doubts, she obeys. She and her sons begin knocking on doors, asking for any spare jar they could borrow. Neighbors must have wondered, what is she doing? What does she plan to do with all these jars? But the widow doesn't explain. She's walking in obedience, driven by a faith that defies logic. With every jar collected, the widow brings them home, filling her house with empty vessels. She closes the door, just as Elisha instructed, and, with her sons by her side, lifts the small jar of oil. She pours, and pours, and pours. Each jar fills to the brim, yet the oil doesn't stop. With every jar she fills, she glances back at the small container, amazed. It's as if God Himself is multiplying each drop, turning her little into an abundance. Finally, when the last jar is full, she calls to her son. "Bring me another jar." Her son replied, "There are no more jars, mother." And at that moment, the oil stops. Not one drop more. Just enough to fill every single jar they had collected. With her heart full of wonder and gratitude, the widow returns to Elisha, who smiles knowingly. He tells her, "Now, go and sell the oil. Pay off your debts, and live on what is left." The oil not only covers her debt but provides enough for her and her sons to live on. What started as a small jar of oil, insignificant and seemingly insufficient, became a symbol of God's provision, stretching far beyond what she could have imagined. This story isn't just about oil or jars, it's a story of faith, obedience, and God's supernatural provision. So many times, we find ourselves in situations that seem hopeless. We look around at what we have, and it feels like so little. But God doesn't ask us to have a lot, He only asks us to trust Him with what we have. Just like the widow, God asks us to step out in faith, even when the world might not understand, even when logic tells us it's impossible. He's not limited by our resources, He's only limited by our willingness to believe. As we close, let this story remind you, when you're down to nothing, God is up to something. He specializes in taking our little and making it more than enough. So, whatever jar you're holding today, whatever small thing you have left, trust that it's all He needs to start a miracle. Faith isn't about having everything figured out. It's about trusting in the one who does. Let this story of the widow's oil inspire you to believe in God's provision, no matter the circumstances. Thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe. See you next time for more amazing stories from the Bible.